As an NRI, what good is commercial property if you are not able to make money from it? You may be looking to induct a tenant. That tenant could be a multinational corporation or it could be a small business. Now, in such a scenario, what are the top 11 or 12 clauses that you need to include in a lease deed? This is your situation, then you are in the right place, because in this video, that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about. Hi everyone, my name is Ramana Reddy and I am a practicing lawyer in the High Court of Telangana. On this channel, I help you by simplifying complex legal concepts. For tips, tricks and general legal information, make sure you hit the subscribe button below. Now, before we talk about what are the clauses to be included in a lease deed, let's talk about why you would even enter into a lease deed. Because there are so many people who enter into a lease without a lease deed. They just do an oral lease. So why would you enter into a lease deed? I think the main reason why as an NRI you would enter into a lease deed is because, first of all, you're living halfway across the world. So there's no way for you to come here and inspect the property and make sure that everything is going as per the oral understanding. I've seen horror stories where, for example, an NRI comes back and he sees that entire floors in a building have been broken down, to suit the purpose of the tenant. And this was never agreed upon. Obviously, when this becomes a dispute, you go to court. There's nothing in writing, so it just becomes your word against their word. That's just one example. There are several other examples. For example, let's say that there was a lock-in period. Let's say that for a period of 6 months, the tenant agrees to be locked in. 3 months in, he says, "I want to quit the property." You say, "Okay, pay the balance three months rent." But he says, "What rent? What lock-in? I don't know what you're talking about." Again, nothing in writing, and you will be in, some kind of a problem. So it's always better to have a written, registered lease deed. Now, I'll get to registration in a bit, but even if you want to have a written lease deed, what are the clauses that you include in the lease deed? That is going to be the topic for our video today. So the first thing to think about, or the first term that you would consider including in your lease deed, is the term of the lease. How long is the lease? Is it for 5 years? Is it for 10 years? Is it for 15 years? And so on. The one thing to keep in mind when you're talking about the term of the lease is the lease commencement date. So let's say, for example, that the lease is signed on the 1st of January and the tenant works on the property for 2 or 3 months. He renovates everything. Let's say starting a restaurant, he gets all these renovation materials and so on. And it takes him about 3 months to get ready. He should not come and argue that, "Look, I was only able to start my business 3 months later. So please do not charge me rent for the first 3 months." Now, all this can be avoided if you have a clear term, which is the start date and the end date. What was the actual start date? Not just the date of signing, but when the lease would start, when the rent would start. The second thing to think about is the rental payments. Ultimately, that's what, as a landlord, that's what you want. So what is the rental payment, from year to year? It's better to have a table. So say if you have something for 10 years, the lease is for 10 years. And for each year, what is the rental payment? And for each year, what is the increment that happens so that, it's clear that, there's no guesswork involved, even there's no even math involved, because basically all the math is already captured. As far as rental amounts go, it's also advisable that you include your bank account details to which the rent has to be transferred. The third thing to be thought about is what are the payment terms. So when will the rent be paid? So let's say for the month of February, will the rent be paid on the 5th of February or will it be paid on the 5th of March? So is it prepaid for the month or is it postpaid for the month? The other thing to think about is a security deposit, because ultimately, you are letting out your property to a tenant and you don't know him very well. So you want to take a security deposit to ensure that once the property is handed over back to you, you can go around, have a look, make sure that there's no major damage to the civil structure of the building and so on. And only then you can hand over the security deposit. The other thing to think about is, if you are paying GST and so on, then is the rental payments, is that inclusive of tax or exclusive of tax? So let's say the rent is 100 rupees, the GST is 18% at 18 rupees, so total comes to 118. So will the tenant only pay you 100 or will the tenant pay you 118? Obviously, if you're paying GST, always advisable to negotiate with tax. The other thing to think about, and at least capture on paper whether you actually enforce or not, is what happens if there's late payment of rent. make sure that, if there's late payment of rent, then that the tenant is somehow penalized, not that through interest, not that, that he will somehow gain by the interest, but at least it acts as a deterrent to the tenant from delayed payment of rent. The next thing to think about is the usage of the property. How is the property going to be used? Is it going to be used as a hospital? Is it going to be used as office space, and so on? And it is important to capture that in the lease deed, because you don't want to show up 2 or 3 years later and find out, in an extreme example, that there's a men's hostel there and there are like 100 people living in that building, which drastically reduces the life of that building. So it is always advisable that you put a clause as to how the property will be used. The next clause to include are is what will be the obligations of the tenant. He has to pay the water bill, the electricity bill, and so on. He has to make sure that he maintains the premises in good condition. He has to ensure that he returns the premises back to you on the, as they were on the date it was handed over to them. You may also include that, he cannot obviously break down floors. He cannot make any civil changes to the building. The next clause you would include, you would say that as the lessor or as the owner of the property, that you are the owner, that you're leasing the property to him, and that you have absolute rights over the property, and at best the tenant only has tenancy rights over the property. Generally speaking, the owner takes care of the property tax that is payable on the property, but that is subject to negotiation between you and the tenant. The other important clause to include is that the tenant should not be allowed to sublet the property. That is, he should not become a landlord himself and then sublet the property to a third party. Now, I can understand a situation where, there's a group of companies and one company wants to sublet it to another company for tax purposes or whatever. That is okay. But if the tenant wants to sublet it to a complete stranger, that should not, that should be a complete no. And the agreement must specifically say that no subletting, no assignment is permitted without prior consent of the landlord. The next thing to include is termination. Termination can happen in a couple of ways. One, it can happen just through efflux of time. So if the lease deed is for 10 years, the lease may expire after 10 years and the lease deed stands terminated if it's not renewed. That is the first way. The second way is, let's say that both of you negotiate that either of you should be able to get out of the lease by providing 3 months notice or 6 months notice and so on, just for convenience. So that is called termination for convenience. And that is a second way in which a termination can happen. The third way in which a termination can happen is termination for breach. The obvious example being, let's say the tenant stops paying you money. In that case, you will say that, look, if you don't make rental payments for 2 months continuously, I will give you a notice. I will give you 1 week to cure the defect, which is to pay back all the money. If you don't do that, then I reserve my right to terminate the lease deed. And don't make the mistake of not including a scheduled property or schedule of property. So towards the end of the lease deed, you just make a section called schedule of the property and you copy the same details as you find it in your sale deed, because that, it sounds too obvious, but a lot of people miss it. You want to identify the property clearly in the document, as to, in which survey number, what is the house number, what is the door number, in which locality, which state, obviously India, north, south, east, west boundaries, so that there is clarity. And what are the square feet or the square yards that are being given out for lease, so that this clarity as to the property or the extent of the property that is being leased out to the tenant. Finally, I would also advise that you have an arbitration clause in the lease agreement. What is an arbitration clause? Basically, the courts in India are clogged with hundreds, thousands, millions of cases. It takes a lot of time for you to get your case adjudicated. To unload the burden of the courts, the legislature, the government has come up with a scheme which is called arbitration, where you can resolve your disputes privately, where you can appoint a private judge, and both parties can argue before the private judge, and the private judge, also known as the arbitrator, would pass an award, it is much quicker as opposed to a court process. So I would highly recommend that you have an arbitration clause in your lease deeds. And lastly, and most importantly, please, please, please get your lease deeds registered. If you don't register your lease deeds, they are as good as toilet paper. And I'm sorry, it's like if that's extreme, but the court will take it and throw it in the dustbin. No term in the lease deed will be upheld. It will be as good as an oral lease. Now, I've heard people say that, that if it is for 11 months, you don't have to get it registered, or if it is for some strip, or if the amount doesn't cross a certain threshold, the rental amount, then you don't have to get it registered. All that is wrong. Even if the lease deed is for a day, if the lease deed is for more than 100 rupees, you need to get the lease deed registered. Don't get the entire document. Don't go through the entire process and then not register the lease deed. You would be doing yourself a great disservice. I hope that video was helpful. Thank you for watching.